Welcome back to another week of 5 Minutes in Mark, your weekly summary of our in-person Bible class on the Gospel of Mark here at Trinity Lutheran in Zanesville. Today we looked at Mark chapter 8. It begins with Jesus feeding the 4,000. We have an interesting verse that leads us into that in verse 4. The disciples answered Jesus, "How can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place?" There were 4,000 people gathered. Jesus, the text says, had compassion on them. The disciples say, but how can anyone feed all these people here in the wilderness? You know, it's a little surprising, maybe even a little funny for us to hear that, because what happened just 2 chapters earlier? You remember, right? Jesus fed the 5,000, and he did it with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And he fed 5,000 men plus women and children, and they had leftovers. And now 2 chapters later, the disciples again are like, how in the world are we going to do this? And yet what does Jesus do? He meets the people's needs. He feeds them. He has compassion on them. And so he takes the bread that they have, 7 loaves of bread and a few fish, and he takes it and feeds the people. And not only did they eat, but again, they had leftovers. They had 7 baskets full. And from the original Greek text, we see that these baskets weren't any ordinary baskets. No, they were the type of baskets that held 50 loaves of bread. That means Jesus took 7 loaves and a couple fish, or few fish. He fed the people, and he had baskets full containing 350 loaves of leftovers. It's incredible what Jesus has done. There's so many similarities between this and the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus saw the people. He had compassion on the people. He fed the people, and there was more left over. But one big difference is the feeding of the 5,000 was in Jewish lands. It was to Jewish people. Now Jesus here in Mark 8, he's not amongst Jewish people. He's amongst Gentiles. And yet is his love or mercy or compassion on them any different? No, it's just as great. It's just as complete. Going on from there, Jesus returns then to Jewish territory, and again, the Pharisees are after him. They are demanding that Jesus gives them a sign. In verse 12, it says, Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit and says, "Why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation." You know, you wonder what would happen if Jesus had given them a sign. My take and my opinion here is that it wouldn't have made a difference. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law were dead set against Jesus and what he was saying. They didn't want to believe that he was the Son of God or the Messiah. They didn't want to believe it because Jesus often spoke against them. They were set and hardened against believing against Christ. Dr. James Veltzo writes something extremely insightful in his commentary on the Gospel of Mark about the narrative of Mark and how it goes with believing and seeing and what order that comes in. Dr. Veltz writes this: in this Gospel, one does not see and then believe. Rather, one believes and then one sees. Otherwise expressed, nothing is so clearly seen that faith will not be needed. Thus, no sign can ever appropriately be given. Instead, one must believe Jesus' word. Isn't that fitting for us here in this text from Mark 8? No sign that Jesus could do would be better or more convincing or more true than his word of truth. And so faith is so important here in Mark's gospel, and that maybe makes it all the more astounding for us that the disciples still are struggling with that. Because we continue on in chapter 8, and the disciples are in the boat with Jesus, and guess what they're talking about? They're talking about how much food they have to eat. They only have 1 loaf. They're wondering, how are we going to eat ourselves? We're not going to have enough food. And Jesus, of course, is a little exasperated at that after what the disciples have witnessed with the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And now they're still worried about their own food and their own well-being, even now, even though they are with Jesus. And so Jesus teaches them. He says, don't you remember about what you've just seen? Don't you know what that means? And finally, he ends it with saying, do you not yet understand? Then after that, Mark has an account of Jesus healing a blind man. And this is the first and the only two-step miracle recorded in the Gospels. What does that mean? Well, it's first, Jesus took the blind man by the hand, led him out of the village, and when he had spit on his eyes, he laid his hands on him. Then he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see men, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. You know, on the surface, it seems like Jesus' first attempt at healing didn't work completely. That needed to be fine-tuned. But we know that's not the way Jesus operates. Jesus has the power to heal, to restore to life, to make perfect immediately, just through the power of his word. And so it's not that Jesus isn't getting this right, but maybe it's something else. Maybe in Mark's narrative, he includes us here for a reason, because the man needed more help to see. You know, the disciples, time and time again, Jesus taught them. He performed miracles in front of them. He taught them who he was and what he had come to do. And yet the disciples still didn't get it. And just before this account of this healing of the blind man, Jesus yet again teaches them once more. This blind man, he didn't get sight right away either. And yet Jesus didn't walk away. He didn't throw up his arms and say, "You're a lost cause." He helped him again. And then the man could see. And that leads us then into the very next text here, where Jesus asks his disciples who they say that he is, and they give all the answers. But then Jesus says, "But who do you say that I am?" And then Peter gives these words of faith. He says, "You are the Christ." Finally, we have this confession of who Jesus is from a disciple. This is a huge turning point then in Mark's gospel. And immediately after this, Jesus starts to teach his disciples about what will come, that he will go to the cross and die and rise again. And yet you see even there that the disciples and Peter, they still aren't completely on board, because Peter pulls Jesus aside and says, "No, this can't be. You can't do this. You can't die." And yet Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Thanks be to God for what he has done for us, for the faith that he has given us. Thanks be to God that he doesn't give up on us when we don't get it time and again, that he doesn't say we're a lost cause when we come to him time and again for forgiveness, but rather that he gives us in his mercy and grace the forgiveness of our sins. And he has given us faith to believe the promises of Jesus, of who he is, and not with a sign or a wonder, but he's given us faith to believe his word and the promise that he tells us there, that Jesus has come to earth to live for us and die for us and rise again, so that we would be a part of God's kingdom, a part of his reign and rule now and until Jesus comes again, and for all time, forevermore. Thanks be to God that he has.